Tonight, we slip into the creaking belly of a ship cutting through the Caribbean, aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, under the black flag of Blackbeard himself. Our story follows a deckhand, not a swashbuckling rogue, but a tired, sea-soaked soul, hauling ropes, patching sails, and praying for fair weather and fewer lashes. Life aboard a pirate ship wasn't all golden glory. It was salt-rubbed wounds, rotten biscuits, and the constant edge of violence, between storms and between shipmates. This isn't a tale of treasure. It's about survival, loyalty bought with rum, fear held tight beneath a torn tricorn hat, and the quiet question in the back of every pirate's mind: how long can this last? If you enjoy drifting into history's forgotten corners, consider liking the video and subscribing. It truly helps us keep telling these gentle, sleep-friendly stories. And here's one for the comments. If you had to serve aboard a pirate ship for 1 month, what job would you take, and why? Cook, carpenter, cannon loader? I'd love to hear your answer before you drift off. Now close your eyes, let the creak of wood and crash of waves carry you, and join me below deck. I suppose most folks think they know what it was like, sailing with Edward Teach. They hear the name Blackbeard and their minds fill with smoke and thunder, cutlasses flashing in the sun, treasure chests overflowing with gold. But the truth of it was mostly rope burns on your hands and the constant ache in your lower back from hauling canvas in a crosswind. My name is William Fletcher, though most called me just Fletcher, and I spent the better part of 2 years aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Not by choice, mind you, at least not at first. I was pressed into service off a merchant vessel near the Carolina coast in the spring of 1717. 23 years old, with calluses already thick on my palms from 7 years working fishing boats out of Portsmouth. The sea was all I knew, but I'd never imagined I'd know it quite like this. The morning they took me, I remember the fog was so thick you could barely see the bow of your own ship. We'd been hauling nets since before dawn, my back already singing that familiar tune of protest, when the lookout's voice cut through the mist like a blade. 3 masts off the starboard bow, closing fast. By the time we could make out her colours, it was far too late to run. I'd heard the stories, of course, every sailor had, but seeing that black flag with its grinning skull and crossed bones, knowing what it meant, that was something different entirely. Your mouth goes dry, and there's this cold feeling that starts in your belly and spreads outward like spilled rum. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a sight to behold, even through the fear. She'd been a slaver originally, a big ship, 300 tons or more, with 40 guns that I could count from where I stood, frozen at our rail. When they came aboard, cutlasses drawn and pistols primed, I expected shouting and chaos. Instead, it was almost businesslike. Teach himself wasn't even there that morning. It was Israel Hands who led the boarding party, a thin man, with pale eyes and a quiet voice that somehow carried more threat than any roar. He looked us over, like a farmer appraising livestock at market, pointing to this man and that. When his finger settled on me, I felt my knees go weak. "You, fisherman, you know boats?" "Aye, sir." My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Good. We need men who understand rope and sail. You'll do." Just like that, my old life was over. They let me gather my few belongings from the forecastle, and then I was climbing down into a longboat, watching my former shipmates grow smaller as we rowed toward the black ship that would be my world for the next 2 years. The first thing that strikes you about a pirate ship is the smell, not the romance of sea spray and tar that you might imagine, but the close, lived-in odour of too many men in too small a space. Unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, the sour tang of beer gone off in the heat. The Queen Anne's Revenge carried near 300 souls at her fullest, and you felt every one of them in the thick air below decks. My hammock was slung in the forward part of the lower deck, squeezed between a gunner named Davers, who snored like a dying horse, and a young man called Timothy, who'd been pressed from a Virginia tobacco ship just a week before me. Timothy was maybe 19, with the soft hands of someone who'd never done real work, and he spent his first 3 nights crying quietly into his thin blanket. I wanted to comfort him, but I was fighting my own fears, my own homesickness for the familiar rhythms of honest work. The ship's routine became my routine quickly enough. Up before dawn to scrub the decks, the salt water cold enough to make your fingers ache, even in the warm Caribbean air. The holy stones we used were chunks of sandstone, rough on your knees as you worked them back and forth across the planking. But there was something soothing about it too. The steady scritch-scritch sound. The way the wood lightened as you worked, grain by grain. After the decks came the endless work with the rigging. The Queen Anne's Revenge carried an enormous spread of canvas, and every piece of it needed constant attention. Sails to be mended, lines to be spliced, blocks to be greased. My hands, already tough from years of fishing, grew even harder. The rough hemp rope left permanent grooves in my palms, and my fingertips developed a thick layer of callus that made it hard to feel anything delicate. But I learned to love the work aloft. Climbing the ratlines in the early morning, when the air was still cool and the sea stretched empty to every horizon, was like entering another world. Up there, 60 feet above the deck, you could forget for a moment what ship you were on, what flag flew above your head. You were just a sailor doing sailor's work, wrestling with canvas that wanted to fly free in the wind. The view from the maintop was something I never tired of. The sea changed colour constantly, from deep blue-black in the early morning to brilliant turquoise when the sun climbed high. Sometimes we'd sail through patches of water so clear you could see straight down to the sandy bottom, 30 feet below. Flying fish would burst from the waves in silver arcs, and dolphins would pace us for miles, playing in our bow wave like children. Edward Teach was not what I'd expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. The stories painted him as a giant, a demon wreathed in smoke and fury. The reality was more complicated. He was tall, certainly, and broad through the shoulders, with that famous black beard that he did indeed weave with slow match before battle. But most days he was just a man doing a job, the same as any ship's captain. He had a way of speaking that drew you in, a deep voice with traces of Bristol in the vowels. He could be charming when he chose to be, telling stories in the evening that had the whole mess laughing until their sides hurt. He knew every man's name on the ship, and he knew their troubles. When Davies the gunner took fever and couldn't keep food down for 3 days, it was Teach himself who brought broth to his hammock. But there was always something else there too, just beneath the surface. A hardness in his eyes when crossed, a stillness that came over him when making decisions that affected other men's lives. I saw him flog a man for stealing rum from the common store, 30 lashes that left the poor soul's back a ruin of torn flesh. Teach's face never changed expression during the punishment, not even when the man screamed. The work was hard, but it was honest work, if you could call anything on a pirate ship honest. We maintained the ship the same as any crew would. We stood watches, we repaired what broke, we kept the Queen Anne's Revenge seaworthy and fast. The difference was in what we did with that speed and seaworthiness. My first prize was taken 6 weeks after I'd been pressed. A small merchant sloop out of Jamaica, heavy laden with sugar and rum. I stood at the rail with the others as we closed on her, my heart hammering against my ribs. The merchant captain had sense enough not to run or fight. He struck his colours as soon as we came within hailing distance, and the whole affair was over in minutes. But those minutes felt like hours. Watching the boarding party swing across on ropes, seeing the frightened faces of men who'd been doing nothing more than sailing cargo from one port to another, just as I'd done for years. I found myself wondering if I'd looked that scared when my own ship was taken. Probably I had. The cargo was good, better than average. Sugar was always welcome, as it traded well in every port, and the rum would keep the crew happy for weeks. But it was the small things I remembered most clearly. A crate of lemons that filled the hold with sweet citrus scent. Bolts of cotton cloth, soft to the touch after months of handling nothing but coarse hemp rope. A box of writing paper and quills that Teach claimed for himself, though I never saw him write a single letter. We transferred what we wanted and let the merchant ship go, as was often Teach's way. He had a reputation for cruelty, but in truth he was more practical than bloodthirsty. Dead men told no tales, as the saying went, but they also couldn't spread word of your mercy. A captain who was known to let prizes go unmolested, who treated captives well, found that most ships would surrender without a fight. It was better for everyone, really. That first prize taught me something about myself that I wasn't sure I wanted to know. When we divided the shares, and I found myself holding more money than I'd ever owned before, there was a moment of pure joy. Not guilt, not shame, just simple happiness at the weight of silver in my hands. I'd been poor my whole life, scraping by on a fisherman's wages, never certain where my next meal would come from. Now I had enough coin to live comfortably for months. The guilt came later, lying in my hammock that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship settling into her evening rhythm. I thought about the merchant captain's face when we'd taken his cargo, not angry, just tired and resigned, like a man who'd known this day would come eventually. I wondered if he had a family, if this loss would mean hunger in some cottage I'd never see. But the guilt faded, as guilt does when faced with daily necessity. I needed to eat, needed a place to sleep, needed work to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. The Queen Anne's revenge provided all of these things, and if the price was my previous life and some abstract sense of right and wrong, well, men had made worse bargains for less. The routine of shipboard life helped. There's something about the endless cycle of watches and meals and work that smooths over the sharp edges of moral thinking. You wake with the dawn, you do your work, you eat your dinner, you sleep. The next day, you do it all again. The sea doesn't care what flag you fly or what cargo you carry. The wind fills your sails just the same. I found myself settling into this new life more easily than I'd expected. The crew was rough, certainly, but no rougher than fishermen or merchant sailors. They were men far from home, doing dangerous work for better pay than they could find anywhere else. Most had stories not so different from mine. Pressed men or sailors who'd volunteered after harsh treatment on Navy ships, or simply those who'd found no other way to make a living in a world that offered few choices to men without education or family connections. There was Samuel, the ship's carpenter, who'd lost his position on a Royal Navy frigate after speaking up for a flogged shipmate. He was a quiet man, with clever hands, who could fashion anything from a bucket to a gun carriage out of whatever wood we had available. He taught me to carve, how to follow the grain of the wood and let it tell you what it wanted to become. I made a small whistle from a piece of mahogany, and though it wasn't much to look at, it gave a clear, sweet note that carried well across the water. There was Joseph, one of the gunners, who'd been a blacksmith in Pennsylvania before a fire took his shop and left him with nothing but the strength in his arms. He knew iron the way Samuel knew wood, could tell you by the sound of hammer on metal whether a gun barrel was sound or ready to burst. He kept our weapons in perfect order, and in quiet moments he'd tell stories of his old life, making horseshoes and barrel hoops and all the thousand small things that kept a colonial town running. These men became my messmates, my companions through long watches and longer storms. We shared our food, our rum rations, our small troubles and smaller victories. When Timothy finally stopped crying at night, it was Joseph who first noticed and quietly spread the word that the boy was finding his sea legs. When I cut my hand badly on a broken bottle, it was Samuel who stitched it closed with thread from a sail, his carpenter's precision making neat small stitches that healed clean. The food aboard ship was about what you'd expect: salt pork that had seen better days, hard tack that had to be soaked in rum or coffee to make it chewable, dried peas that turned to mush no matter how you cooked them. But the cook, a former slave named Marcus, who'd earned his freedom by swimming to our ship during a raid on a South Carolina plantation, had a gift for making the most of what we had. He could take our basic provisions and somehow create meals that actually tasted like food. His fish stew was legendary among the crew. When we were lucky enough to catch fresh fish, Marcus would simmer them with whatever vegetables we had, bits of salt pork for flavour, and spices traded or taken from merchant ships. The smell would fill the lower deck, and men would start gathering around the galley long before the dinner bell rang. I'd seen hardened pirates, men who'd faced down armed opponents without flinching, nearly come to blows over the last serving of Marcus's stew. But it was the coffee that really made life bearable. Strong black coffee boiled in a massive pot that seemed to be constantly simmering. We drank it at every meal, and between meals too when the watch allowed. It cut through the salt taste that seemed to cling to everything at sea, warmed you through when the wind turned cold, and gave you something to wrap your hands around during the long, dark hours of the middle watch. I learned to treasure those quiet hours, 4 bells to 8 bells in the depth of night, when half the ship slept and the other half moved through their duties like ghosts. The ship would settle into a different rhythm then, creaking gently as she rode the swells. The only sounds the whisper of wind through rigging and the soft footfalls of men on watch. It was peaceful in a way that daylight never allowed, a kind of meditation that came from doing familiar work while your mind drifted free. Standing lookout in the crow's nest during those hours, I'd watch the stars wheel overhead and try to make sense of my new life. The constellations were the same ones I'd learned as a boy, fishing with my father off the English coast. The North Star held steady in its place, indifferent to what men did beneath its light. There was comfort in that constancy, in knowing that some things remained unchanged, no matter how far you travelled or what choices you made. The weather in those waters was like nothing I'd known before. Sudden squalls that would appear out of nowhere, turning the sea from blue to black in minutes. The wind would go from gentle breeze to howling gale with barely any warning, and you'd find yourself fighting to take in sail before it tore itself to ribbons. But then the storm would pass just as quickly, leaving behind air so clean and clear it seemed you could see forever, and seas that sparkled like scattered diamonds. I remember one morning after such a storm, standing at the bow as the sun rose. The ship was riding easy swells that caught the light and threw it back in sheets of gold and green. Flying fish were everywhere, their fins glittering as they skipped across the wave tops. A pod of whales passed close enough that we could hear them breathing, great sounds like distant thunder. The whole world seemed washed clean and new, and for a moment I forgot entirely where I was and what I'd become. These were the moments that sustained me through the harder times. And there were harder times, make no mistake. Days when the heat was so fierce that the tar in the deck seams bubbled and your clothes stuck to your skin with sweat. Nights when storms came one after another, leaving you exhausted from constantly adjusting sail and pumping out the bilge. Times when the wind died completely and we sat becalmed for days, the ship rolling gently in the oily swells while tempers grew short and water rations grew smaller. But even the hardest days had their rhythms, their small satisfactions. The feel of a rope running smooth through your hands as you hauled on a halyard. The sight of canvas filling with wind after hours of calm. The taste of fresh rainwater caught in canvas during a squall, sweet after weeks of stale water from the barrels. These simple pleasures took on an importance they'd never had in my old life, probably because they were earned through difficulty. The Queen Anne's Revenge herself was a fine ship, I have to admit. Fast for her size, handy in all kinds of weather, with enough firepower to make even Navy frigates think twice about engaging. She'd been built as a slaver originally, designed to carry human cargo in the most efficient way possible, and that efficiency showed in every line of her construction. She wasn't beautiful the way some ships were beautiful, but she was purposeful, built to do a job and do it well. I came to know every inch of her in those first months, every plank and rope and block and tackle, the way she moved in different seas, the sounds she made in different winds. Ships develop personalities over time, like people do, and the Queen Anne's Revenge was starting to show hers. She was steady and reliable, but she had moods too. In certain winds, she'd develop a slight roll that could make you seasick if you weren't prepared for it. In heavy seas, she'd bury her bow deep in the waves and then shake herself like a dog, sending spray clear back to the quarterdeck. Living so closely with nearly 300 other men taught me things about human nature that I'd never had occasion to learn before. How quickly grudges could form over trivial matters. How important small rituals became when you had no privacy and few possessions. The way a man's true character showed itself under stress and boredom and constant proximity to others. Some men thrived in this environment. They seemed to draw energy from the close quarters and shared purpose, becoming more themselves somehow. Others withdrew into sullen silence, doing their work but keeping their thoughts to themselves. A few couldn't handle it at all, and either broke under the strain or found ways to leave the ship, sometimes permanently. I found myself somewhere in the middle, adapting as I'd always adapted, making the best of circumstances I couldn't change. I learned to sleep despite Davy's snoring and Timothy's occasional nightmares. I learned to find moments of solitude even in the crowded lower deck, small spaces of mental quiet that belonged to me alone. I learned to read the moods of the crew, to know when tensions were rising and when it was best to keep your head down and your mouth shut. And slowly, almost without noticing it, I learned to think of the Queen Anne's Revenge as home. A Deckhand on Blackbeard's Ship, Part 2. The first time I saw Edward Teach truly angry, it was over something as simple as a torn sail. We'd been running before a stiff breeze for 3 days, making good time toward the Bahamas, when the main topsail split right down the middle with a sound like thunder. These things happen at sea, no fault of anyone really, just the inevitable result of canvas and wind and time. But Teach had been in a black mood for days, brooding over some letter he'd received in our last port, and the sight of that sail, flapping in tatters, seemed to break something loose in him. I was working on the foredeck when I heard his voice, not shouting but somehow carrying clear across the ship despite the wind. By the time I looked up, he was already climbing the ratlines, moving with the easy grace of a man who'd spent half his life aloft. He reached the torn sail in moments and stood there on the yard, 60 feet above the deck, examining the damage with his hands, while the ship rolled beneath him. When he came down, his face was set in hard lines. He called for Briggs, the sailmaker, and when the old man hurried over with his kit of needles and thread, Teach just looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The whole ship seemed to hold its breath. Then quietly, almost gently, he told Briggs to patch what could be patched and report on what would need replacing. No anger, no blame, just a captain dealing with the endless small crises that make up life at sea. But I caught him later that evening, standing alone at the stern rail, staring out at our wake as it disappeared into the gathering dusk. There was something in his posture, the way his shoulders held tension, that spoke of a man carrying more weight than just the command of a ship. I was coiling lines nearby, and, though he surely knew I was there, he didn't acknowledge my presence, just stood there watching the water, lost in thoughts I couldn't begin to guess at. It was Marcus who explained it to me later, as we shared the last of the coffee around the dying galley fire. The letter had been from Bathtown, from the woman Teach had married during one of his attempts at respectability. Word was she'd taken up with another man, someone who could offer her a life that didn't involve waiting months at a time to know if her husband was alive or dead. Marcus told it without judgment, the way he told most stories, but I could hear the sympathy in his voice. Captain's got more ghosts than most, Marcus said, stirring the dregs of his coffee with a splinter of wood. Man tries to be two different people. Sometimes he ends up being neither one very well. I thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, as I watched Teach go about the business of being a pirate captain. During the day he was all business, checking the set of the sails, conferring with Israel hands about our course, settling disputes among the crew with quick decisions that brooked no argument. But in the evenings, I'd sometimes catch him in unguarded moments, and I'd see something else there. Not the fearsome Blackbeard of legend, just a man in his 30s who'd chosen a path that led away from everything most people considered a normal life. We made landfall in Nassau 3 weeks after the sail incident, and my first sight of that pirate haven was something I'll never forget. The harbour was full of ships flying black flags, sloops and brigantines, and the occasional frigate, all crammed together in the shallow water like pigs at a trough. The town itself was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings thrown up on the beach, but it buzzed with activity. Merchants who didn't ask too many questions about where your goods came from, taverns that stayed open all night, shipwrights who could repair battle damage without reporting it to any authorities. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires and forge bellows, and the smell of roasting meat mixed with the ever-present odours of tar and salt water, and too many people living too close together. But there was an energy to the place that you could feel in your bones, a sense of possibility and danger that made your pulse quicken despite yourself. We anchored in the harbour and spent the next 2 weeks careening the ship, hauling her over on her side to scrape the bottom clean of weed and barnacles. It was brutal work, standing waist deep in the warm harbour water while you scraped and caulked and painted, but it was necessary if we wanted to keep our speed advantage over the heavily laden merchant ships we preyed upon. I learned more about my shipmates during those 2 weeks than I had in the previous 3 months. Away from the confined quarters and rigid routine of shipboard life, their personalities emerged more clearly. Samuel the carpenter turned out to have a fine singing voice and would lead impromptu concerts around the beach fires in the evening. Joseph the gunner was a gifted storyteller, spinning tales of his life in Pennsylvania that had us all laughing until our sides ached. Timothy, the young man who'd been pressed from the tobacco ship, had found his confidence at last. The soft boy who'd cried himself to sleep those first weeks was gone, replaced by someone harder, but also more sure of himself. He'd learned to splice rope and reef sail with the best of us, and had earned the respect of men twice his age through simple competence and willingness to pull his weight. But it was during those Nassau weeks that I first began to understand the real cost of the life we were living. One evening, sitting around a driftwood fire with a bottle of rum passing from hand to hand, Davies the gunner started talking about his home in Cornwall. He'd left behind a wife and 2 young daughters when he'd been pressed into the Navy, and had been at sea for 8 years now, with no word from home. "Could be they think I'm dead," he said, staring into the flames. "Could be they're right, in all the ways that matter." The bottle went around again, and other stories came out. Men who'd left families behind, or who'd had families and lost them to disease or poverty or simple bad luck. Men who'd been born into lives that offered them nothing but hard work and early death, and had chosen this instead. Men who'd made one bad decision and found it led to another and another, until they were so far from their original path that they couldn't even remember what it had looked like. I found myself thinking about my own situation differently after those conversations. I'd been pressed, true enough, but I was also being paid better than I'd ever been paid in my life. I was learning skills that would serve me well in any ship, pirate or otherwise. And if I was honest with myself, there was a part of me that enjoyed the freedom of it, the absence of the grinding poverty that had defined my previous existence. But I was also becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. When we took our next prize, a Spanish merchant ship heavy with silver from the New World, I felt none of the guilt that had troubled me after that first capture. Instead, I found myself calculating my share of the cargo with the same casual efficiency as any veteran pirate. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, like the way your hands develop calluses without you noticing, until one day you realize you can grip rough rope without pain. The Spanish ship was different from our previous prizes. Her captain was a proud man who initially refused to surrender, and it took a show of our superior firepower to convince him that resistance was futile. When he finally struck his colours, His face was dark with humiliation, and he spat curses in rapid Spanish that needed no translation. Teach handled the situation with his usual mixture of firmness and pragmatism. He treated the Spanish captain with the respect due to a fellow sailor, even as his crew systematically looted the man's ship. The silver was loaded into our holds with efficient speed, but Teach also ensured that the Spanish crew was left with enough food and water to reach the nearest port. It was good business, he explained later. Word would spread that Blackbeard was ruthless but not needlessly cruel, and future prizes would be more likely to surrender without a fight. My share of that Spanish silver was more money than my father had seen in his entire life. I held the coins in my hands that night, feeling their weight, their cool smoothness. Each piece represented months of honest work for most men, and here I was holding dozens of them as my portion of a single day's labour. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I'm not sure I had the words then to express what I was feeling. The work itself remained the same, regardless of what cargo we carried or what flag we flew. Ships need constant maintenance, and the Queen Anne's Revenge was no exception. The rigging required daily attention, with lines to be replaced, blocks to be greased, and canvas to be mended. The deck needed scrubbing every morning, not just for cleanliness, but to prevent the salt build-up that could make the planking slippery and dangerous. I'd grown to love the early morning routine of holystoning the deck. There was something meditative about the repetitive motion, the gradual transformation of dark salt-stained wood into clean, pale planking. The work started before dawn, when the air was cool and the ship quiet except for the watch. You'd start at the bow and work your way aft, the sandstone blocks grinding against the wood with a sound like whispered conversations. By the time the sun rose, the entire deck would gleam pale gold in the early light, and you'd have worked up enough of a sweat to make the morning breeze feel like a blessing. Your knees would ache from the constant kneeling, and your shoulders would burn from the scrubbing motion, but there was satisfaction in the work too. A clean deck was a safe deck, and a safe deck was one small piece of order imposed on the chaos of life at sea. The food continued to be Marcus's domain, and he ruled the galley with the absolute authority of someone who controlled the one thing every man aboard needed multiple times each day. His kingdom consisted of a brick-lined firebox, a collection of iron pots that had seen better decades, and whatever provisions we could carry or capture. But somehow he managed to create meals that were not just edible, but actually welcome. His morning porridge was a particular triumph, made from oats when we had them, cornmeal when we didn't, and whatever dried fruit or nuts he could acquire. He'd cook it slowly, stirring constantly to prevent burning, and season it with molasses or honey if our stores allowed. Served with ship's biscuit that had been softened in coffee, it was a meal that could sustain you through a morning of hard work aloft. But it was his way with fish that really set Marcus apart. When we were lucky enough to catch something fresh, he could prepare it a dozen different ways. Grilled over an open fire, with nothing but salt and whatever herbs he'd managed to dry and preserve. Stewed with onions and peppers acquired in our last port. Pickled in vinegar and spices that would preserve it for weeks. He had an intuitive understanding of how flavours worked together, probably learned during his years of slavery when he'd had to make meals from whatever scraps were available. The evening meal was always the day's main event, not just for the food, but for the company. After a day of scattered work and individual tasks, supper brought the entire crew together in the lower deck. Men would gather around the long tables made from planks and sawhorses, sharing not just food but stories, complaints, rumours, and the 1,000 small observations that make up a day at sea. These meals were when I learned most about my shipmates' previous lives. Joseph would talk about the satisfaction of working iron, the way you could feel in the hammer's ring whether a piece was heating properly. Samuel would describe the smell of fresh wood shavings, the pleasure of seeing a piece of timber transform into something useful under your hands. Even the quieter men would sometimes share memories, prompted by the relaxed atmosphere and the rum that Marcus always managed to include with the evening meal. I found myself talking too, telling stories about fishing off the English coast, about my father's small boat, and the way the water changed colour when schools of herring passed beneath. I described the peculiar satisfaction of hauling nets full of silver fish, the burning in your arms and back that somehow felt good because it meant a successful catch. I talked about the way fog could close in without warning, turning familiar waters into an alien landscape where sound carried strangely, and you navigated by instinct and memory. These conversations created bonds that went deeper than the simple necessity of working together. When you've shared your stories with someone, when you've heard about their joys and losses and the small details that made up their previous life, it becomes harder to see them as just another member of the crew. They become individuals with histories and hopes, men who'd made choices and had choices made for them, who'd ended up on this ship through paths as varied as the men themselves. The work aloft remained my favourite part of each day. There was something about being 60 feet above the deck, with the ship spread out below and the horizon visible in all directions, that cleared my mind in a way nothing else could. The physical demands of working with sail and rigging in a moving ship required complete concentration, leaving no room for worry or regret or the complicated thoughts that could plague you during quieter moments. I learned to read the wind's moods in the behaviour of the canvas, to feel in the ship's motion when weather was coming long before it appeared on the horizon. A slight change in the way the mainsail drew, a different note in the rigging's song, the way the ship's motion shifted from rhythmic to restless. All these were signals that spoke to you if you knew how to listen. Working aloft in heavy weather was dangerous but exhilarating. When squalls appeared suddenly, as they often did in those waters, you might find yourself taking in sail, while rain lashed your face and wind tried to tear you from your perch. The wet rigging became treacherous, and canvas that had been docile in light air turned into a wild thing that fought your every attempt to control it. But there was a particular satisfaction in battling the elements and winning, when you'd managed to reef the topsails before they could tear themselves apart, when you'd secured loose lines that could have done real damage if left to whip about in the wind, when you'd done your part to keep the ship safe through another storm. You felt a pride that went deeper than any wages. The storms themselves were spectacular things to witness, provided you weren't trying to work in them. I'd seen plenty of bad weather during my years on fishing boats, but Caribbean squalls had their own character. They'd build quickly, towering masses of black cloud that seemed to spring from nowhere, and they'd hit with a violence that could be truly frightening until you learned to read their patterns. The rain came in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The wind would shift and veer without warning, requiring constant adjustment of the sails to prevent damage. Lightning would split the sky in brilliant forks that left purple after-images burned into your vision, followed by thunder so close it seemed to come from inside your own chest. But then they'd pass, often as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving behind air so clean and clear it seemed you could see to the edge of the world. The sea would settle back into long, easy swells that caught the returning sunlight and threw it back in sheets of gold and silver. Flying fish would emerge to skip across the wave tops, and sometimes dolphins would appear to ride our bow wave, as if celebrating the storm's passing. It was after one such storm, as we sailed north toward the Carolina coast, that we encountered the merchant convoy that would change everything for me. 3 ships sailing together for protection, escorted by a small naval sloop. Individually, none of them was a match for the Queen Anne's Revenge, but together they represented a more serious challenge than our usual prey. Teach studied them through his spyglass for the better part of an hour, weighing the risks against the potential reward. The convoy was clearly valuable, heavy laden and sailing the route favoured by ships carrying goods from the Caribbean to the northern colonies. But the naval escort, though small, was well armed and would certainly fight rather than surrender. In the end, it was the wind that decided matters. A shift in the breeze gave us the weather gauge, allowing us to approach from upwind where our superior firepower would count for most. Teach made his decision with the calm calculation I come to expect from him, issuing orders that sent the crew to their battle stations with practiced efficiency. I'd been through several captures by this point, but this was different. The previous prizes had surrendered without serious resistance, but the presence of that naval escort meant we were likely to face real opposition. As I helped load the great guns and prepare the boarding equipment, I found my hands shaking slightly, with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The battle, when it came, was shorter and more confused than I'd expected. The naval sloop tried to position herself between us and the merchant ships, but our superior speed allowed us to isolate and overwhelm her. A few broadsides from our 40 guns convinced her captain that discretion was the better part of valour, and she struck her colours after taking damage to her rigging that left her unable to manoeuvre effectively. With their escort neutralised, the merchant ships had no choice but to surrender. The whole affair was over in less than 2 hours, but those 2 hours felt like a lifetime. The thunder of the guns, the screaming of shot overhead, the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke that burned your throat and made your eyes water, all of it combined to create a sensory overload that left you feeling stunned and hyper-aware at the same time. My job during the action had been to help service one of the stern chasers, loading and firing under the direction of one of the experienced gunners. The work was hot and exhausting, manhandling the heavy gun back into position after each shot, swabbing the barrel clean, ramming home the next charge of powder and shot. The noise was indescribable, not just the sound of our own guns, but the whistle and crash of enemy shots striking our hull. But through it all, there was an odd sense of satisfaction in doing the work well, in being part of a crew that functioned smoothly, even under the extreme stress of combat. Each man knew his job and did it without hesitation, and the result was a level of efficiency that impressed even me, accustomed as I'd become to the seamanship skills of the pirate crew. The aftermath was always strange, the sudden quiet after the guns stopped firing, the way normal sounds seemed unnaturally loud after the thunder of battle. We'd taken some damage to our rigging, nothing serious but enough to require immediate attention. I found myself back aloft, splicing lines and patching canvas, working by touch as much as sight in the gathering dusk. The prizes yielded cargo worth more than all our previous captures combined. Sugar and rum, of course, but also manufactured goods from Europe, fine cloth and metalwork, and luxury items destined for the wealthy planters of Virginia and the Carolinas. My share alone was enough to set me up comfortably for years if I chose to leave the pirate life behind. But as I held those coins in my hands that night, counting out my portion by candlelight in the cramped lower deck, I realised that the money wasn't really the point anymore. Somewhere along the way, the Queen Anne's Revenge had become more than just a temporary refuge from poverty. It had become home, in a way that no place had been since I'd left my father's cottage years before. The crew had become family, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence in a way that went deeper than blood relationships. When Davies had been wounded by a splinter during the battle, it was Timothy who'd stayed with him while Marcus cleaned and dressed the wound. When the mainmast had been damaged by enemy shot, it was Samuel who'd worked through the night to fashion a temporary repair that would hold until we could reach port. These bonds of mutual reliance created a kind of intimacy that was rare in the wider world. We knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, fears and hopes, the small habits and preferences that make up a person's character. We'd seen each other at their best and worst, in moments of courage and moments of failure, and somehow we'd all found ways to forgive the failures and celebrate the successes. The ship herself had become as familiar as my own body. I knew every rope and block, every beam and plank, every peculiarity of her construction and behaviour. I could find my way about her in complete darkness, navigate her narrow passages and steep ladders by touch alone. The sound she made in different winds and seas had become as meaningful as human speech, telling me things about her condition and mood that no amount of formal inspection could reveal. Living so closely with the same group of men for months at a time, you learned to read the subtle signs of mood and temperament that could mean the difference between harmony and conflict. You knew when someone was having a bad day and needed space, when they were looking for company, when they were wrestling with problems they couldn't or wouldn't share. You learned to navigate the complex web of relationships and rivalries that developed in any closed community. The routines of shipboard life had become second nature, as automatic as breathing. The 4-hour watches that divided each day into predictable segments, the daily tasks of maintenance and repair that kept the ship seaworthy, the weekly rituals of cleaning and inspection that maintained order and discipline. All of it had become part of me in a way that my previous life, for all its familiarity, had never been. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to live with uncertainty in a way that my previous life had never required. Each day brought the possibility of sudden violence, of storms that could dismast us, or reefs that could hole us below the waterline. Each sail on the horizon might be a harmless merchant or a heavily armed naval vessel bent on our destruction. Each port we entered might welcome us or attempt to capture us. This constant awareness of danger had a paradoxical effect. Rather than making me fearful, it made me more present, more aware of each moment as it passed. The simple pleasure of a calm morning watch, the satisfaction of a job well done, the taste of fresh water after days of stale, the warmth of the sun on your face after a cold night. All these things took on an intensity they'd never had when I could take them for granted. I began to understand why some men chose this life voluntarily, despite its obvious dangers and moral ambiguities. There was a freedom in it that went beyond the absence of masters and bosses. It was the freedom that came from living entirely in the present, from accepting uncertainty as the natural condition of existence, from finding meaning in the immediate tasks at hand rather than in distant goals or abstract principles. The sea itself had become my teacher in ways I couldn't have imagined during my years as a fisherman. Then, the ocean had been simply a workplace, dangerous but familiar, a source of food and income that I understood through long experience. Now it had become something larger, a force that shaped not just my daily activities, but my entire way of seeing the world. I learned to read its moods in the colour of the water, the behaviour of the waves, the quality of light reflected from its surface. I learned to feel changes in weather through the ship's motion, to sense the approach of distant storms in the way the swells lengthened and deepened. I learned to navigate by the stars with an accuracy that would have seemed impossible during my landlubber youth. But more than that, I learned to accept the sea's fundamental indifference to human concerns. It would carry you safely for months and then kill you without warning for no reason you could understand. It would provide calm passages when you needed them least, and savage storms when you could least afford them. It operated by rules that had nothing to do with human justice or desert, and learning to live with that capriciousness was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. The other lesson the sea taught was humility. No matter how skilled you became, how well you knew your ship, how carefully you read the signs of weather and current, there would always be situations that exceeded your understanding or ability to control. The wise sailor learned to do everything possible to ensure safety and success, and then to accept whatever outcome followed with as much grace as he could muster. This acceptance didn't mean passivity or fatalism. Every man aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge worked constantly to improve his skills, to maintain the ship in the best possible condition, to prepare for the challenges they knew would come. But they also understood that preparation could only take you so far, and that survival often depended as much on luck as on skill. As my second year aboard the ship began, I found myself taking on new responsibilities. Teach had noticed my growing competence with rigging work, and I was increasingly called upon to lead small teams of men in complex repairs or modifications. It was satisfying work, using not just your hands, but your mind to solve problems that had no predetermined solutions. When the foremast developed a crack that threatened to bring down the entire sail plan, it was my idea to reinforce it with iron bands fashioned by Joseph in his makeshift forge. When we needed to modify the ship's boat davits to accommodate a larger prize vessel we'd captured, I was the one who figured out how to redistribute the load-bearing points to prevent damage to the ship's structure. These problems required you to think in 3 dimensions, to visualize how forces would flow through the ship's structure, to anticipate how your changes would affect the vessel's balance and handling. It was the kind of work that engaged your entire mind, leaving no room for the doubts and regrets that could plague you during idle moments. The mathematical aspects of the work fascinated me. The precise calculations required to determine rope strength and load distribution, the geometric relationships between sail area and mast placement, the physics of how wind and water interacted with the ship's hull, all of it opened up new ways of understanding the world around me. Samuel the carpenter became my unofficial teacher in these matters, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated through decades of working with wood and rope and canvas. He had an intuitive understanding of structural engineering that went far beyond anything he could have learned from books, knowledge gained through patient observation and hard-won experience. Under his guidance, I learned to see the ship not as a collection of separate parts, but as an integrated system where every component affected every other component. A change to the rigging might alter the ship's centre of gravity. A modification to the hull could affect how she handled in heavy seas. Everything was connected, and understanding those connections was the key to making improvements that actually worked. The work was endlessly varied, presenting new challenges almost daily. Storm damage that required creative solutions with limited materials. Modifications to accommodate different types of cargo or different numbers of crew. Improvements to increase speed or maneuverability or firepower. Each problem was unique, requiring you to combine established principles with innovative thinking. But perhaps the most valuable skill I learned was how to work effectively with other men under pressure. When the mainmast was damaged in a sudden squall and we had only hours to effect repairs before the next storm hit, success depended not just on technical knowledge, but on clear communication, efficient organisation, and the ability to remain calm when everything was at stake. I learned to give orders that were understood and followed, to listen to suggestions from men with different areas of expertise, to coordinate complex tasks involving multiple teams working simultaneously. These leadership skills proved just as valuable as any technical knowledge, and they served me well as I gradually took on more responsibility aboard the ship. The social dynamics of the crew continued to evolve as well. Men came and went as fortunes changed and opportunities arose. Some chose to leave when we made port, taking their accumulated shares to start new lives ashore. Others were lost to disease or accident or the occasional battle. New men joined the crew as we recruited replacements or absorbed sailors from captured ships who chose to join us rather than be set ashore. Each change in personnel affected the ship's social balance. New alliances formed while old ones dissolved. Different personalities brought different strengths and weaknesses to the crew's collective character. Some changes were positive, bringing new skills or simply fresh energy to a group that had grown stale. Others created tensions that had to be carefully managed to prevent serious conflict. Teach proved remarkably skilled at managing these human dynamics. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how different personalities would interact, and he was careful to separate men who might clash while bringing together those whose skills complemented each other. When serious conflicts did arise, he dealt with them quickly and decisively before they could spread and poison the entire crew's morale. I watched him navigate these challenges with growing respect for his leadership abilities. Being a pirate captain wasn't just about seamanship and fighting, though those skills were certainly important. It was also about psychology, about understanding what motivated different types of men and how to channel their energies toward common goals. The treasure we accumulated during this period was substantial, but I began to understand that money was only one form of wealth. The skills I was learning, the knowledge I was gaining about ships and the sea and the management of men, these were assets that would serve me for the rest of my life, regardless of what path I chose to follow. The confidence I'd gained was perhaps even more valuable. When I'd first been pressed into service, I'd been just another unskilled labourer, interchangeable with thousands of other poor men scraping by on the margins of society. Now I was becoming someone with specialised knowledge and proven competence, someone whose opinions were sought and whose judgment was trusted. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were times when I made mistakes that cost time or materials or endangered the ship. There were moments when I doubted my abilities or questioned whether I was really cut out for the responsibilities I was taking on. But gradually, through the accumulation of small successes and learned lessons, I grew into the role. The ship herself continued to be my greatest teacher. She was a complex machine that demanded constant attention and care, but she also responded to that care in ways that were almost human. When properly maintained and skillfully handled, she would perform beyond her designed capabilities. When neglected or abused, she would develop problems that could threaten everyone aboard. Learning to read her moods and respond to her needs became second nature. The slight vibration that meant a stay was working loose. The change in her motion that indicated the cargo had shifted. The different note in the rigging song that warned of approaching weather. All these signals became as clear as spoken words to those who knew how to listen. But the Queen Anne's Revenge was more than just a machine or a workplace. She was our home, our protection, our means of livelihood, and our route to whatever future awaited us. She carried not just our bodies, but our hopes and dreams and fears. In a very real sense, our fates were bound up with hers, and caring for her was a form of caring for ourselves. As I settled into my hammock each night, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship working in the seaway, I often reflected on how much my life had changed since that foggy morning when I'd been pressed from the fishing boat. The scared young man who climbed down into that longboat seemed like a different person, entirely someone I could barely remember being. The changes went deeper than just skills and knowledge, though those were certainly important. I'd developed a different relationship with uncertainty, with danger, with the future itself. The careful planning and worry that had characterized my previous life had given way to a more immediate way of living, focused on doing each day's work well and letting tomorrow take care of itself. This wasn't recklessness or fatalism, but rather a kind of practical wisdom that came from living in circumstances where long-term planning was largely meaningless. You could prepare for likely contingencies and maintain your equipment in good order, but you couldn't control the weather or the political situation or the decisions of other ships' captains. Learning to focus on what you could control while accepting what you couldn't was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. A Deckhand on Blackbeard's ship, Part 3. The morning I woke to find we were sailing in company with 3 other pirate vessels marked the beginning of what would become the most eventful period of my time with Blackbeard. The sight of those black flags snapping in the dawn breeze filled me with a mixture of excitement and unease that I couldn't quite name at the time. Charles Vane's sloop Ranger rowed off our starboard quarter, while Calico Jack Rackham's smaller vessel and another ship I didn't recognise completed our small flotilla. I'd been aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge for nearly 18 months by then, long enough that the morning routine of holystoning the deck felt as natural as breathing. But that morning was different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that had the entire crew moving with unusual purpose. Even the old hands who'd sailed with Teach for years seemed more alert than usual, checking their gear with the careful attention of men who expected to need it soon. The conference of captains took place aboard our ship, as befitted Teach's status as the senior commander. I watched from the rigging as the other boats approached, their crews pulling with the synchronized rhythm that marked experienced sailors. Vane himself was first up the side, a tall man with dark hair tied back in a queue, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command, but I noticed he deferred to Teach in small ways that spoke of genuine respect rather than mere diplomacy. Rackham was younger, perhaps no more than 25, with the kind of elaborate clothing that marked him as someone who cared about appearances. His coat was fine blue silk with silver buttons, and his breeches were cut in the latest fashion. But his hands were scarred and calloused like any working sailor's, and the way he examined our rigging as he came aboard told me he knew ships as well as he knew fashion. The third captain was a surprise, a woman who introduced herself simply as Mary. She was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and hair bleached nearly white by salt air. She wore plain seaman's clothing and carried herself with the unassuming competence that I'd learned to associate with the most dangerous people. Her crew clearly respected her, following her orders with the immediate obedience that came only from proven leadership under fire. The captain's conference lasted most of the morning, conducted in Teach's cabin while the rest of us went about our regular duties, with one ear always turned toward the stern windows. Bits of conversation drifted out occasionally, fragments about shipping lanes and naval patrols, and the movements of heavily laden treasure fleets. But mostly we were left to speculate and wonder what grand enterprise was being planned behind those closed doors. Marcus, as usual, proved to be the best source of information. His position as cook gave him reasons to move about the ship that others lacked, and his quiet manner meant people often forgot he was listening. During the midday meal, he shared what he'd overheard with his usual economy of words. "Spanish treasure fleet," he said quietly, ladling out portions of his fish stew. "Annual sailing from Cartagena to Cadiz, 6 galleons, 4 frigates, more silver than all of us have seen in our lifetimes combined." The implications hung in the air like smoke from his galley fire. A treasure fleet of that size would be heavily defended, with experienced naval officers and professional soldiers aboard the escort vessels. It would be the kind of target that could make us all wealthy beyond imagination, or get us all killed in the attempt. Probably both possibilities were equally likely. But the lure of such a prize was impossible to ignore. During the long afternoon watch, as we sailed south in loose formation with our new companions, I found myself calculating what my share might be from such a capture. Even divided among 4 crews, it would be enough to set me up for life, to buy a small estate somewhere far from the sea and live like a gentleman for whatever years remained to me. The practical sailor in me wondered if we had the firepower to take on such a convoy. Our combined force was formidable by pirate standards, perhaps 120 guns in total, but Spanish treasure fleets were defended by ships of the line with experienced crews and the best artillery money could buy. It would be like 4 wolves attacking a herd of buffalo, relying on speed and cunning to overcome superior strength. The days that followed settled into a new routine as our small fleet worked its way south through the Caribbean waters I'd come to know so well. The weather was perfect for sailing, with steady trade winds that pushed us along at a comfortable pace and scattered clouds that provided occasional relief from the tropical sun. Flying fish kept pace with our bow wave, their silver bodies catching the light as they skipped across the wave tops, and dolphins appeared regularly to play in our wake. But beneath the peaceful surface, tension was building among the crews. Men cleaned their weapons more frequently than usual, testing the action of pistol locks and honing cutlass blades to razor sharpness. The gunners spent extra time checking their charges and shot, making sure everything was ready for action at a moment's notice. Even the ship's boys seemed affected by the mood, going about their duties with unusual seriousness. I found myself thinking more often about the life I'd left behind, something I'd rarely done during my first year aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. My father's small cottage in Portsmouth, the familiar rhythm of hauling nets at dawn, the simple pleasure of selling a good catch at the market. It had been a hard life, certainly, with never quite enough money and always the worry of what tomorrow might bring. But it had also been a predictable life, where the worst thing that could happen was a poor fishing season or a broken net. Now I was sailing toward what might be the greatest prize in pirate history, or toward my own death in a battle with the most powerful navy in the world. The uncertainty was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering whether you had the courage to jump. Timothy noticed my introspective mood during one of the evening watches. He'd grown into a capable sailor over the past months, shedding the last traces of the frightened boy who'd cried himself to sleep during those first weeks. Now he was someone the newer crew members looked to for guidance, a position he wore with quiet confidence. "Penny for your thoughts, Fletcher," he said, settling beside me at the rail as we watched the phosphorescence swirl in our wake. "Just wondering if we're sailing toward fortune or disaster," I admitted. "Maybe both." He nodded thoughtfully. "Been having the same thoughts myself. But then I remember what my life was like before, working tobacco fields from dawn to dusk for barely enough to keep body and soul together. Even if this ends badly, at least I've lived more in these past months than in all the years before combined." His words stayed with me as I made my way to my hammock that night. There was truth in what he'd said. Whatever else could be said about the pirate life, it wasn't boring. Every day brought new challenges, new experiences, new tests of skill and courage. Even the routine work of maintaining the ship felt more meaningful when you knew that lives might depend on doing it well. The skills I'd developed during my time aboard continued to evolve and deepen. Samuel had begun teaching me the finer points of carpentry, showing me how to select wood for different purposes, and how to join pieces together with joints that would hold under the severe stresses of life at sea. Working with hand tools in the confined space of the ship's hold required a different kind of precision than I'd known before, a patient attention to detail that couldn't be rushed. "Wood has memory," Samuel told me one afternoon as we shaped a replacement block for the main rigging. "It remembers which way it grew, how the rain fell on it, where the wind bent it. You work with that memory, not against it, and it'll serve you well. Fight it, and it'll break when you need it most." I learned to read the grain patterns that told you how a piece would behave under stress, to feel with my hands the subtle differences between heartwood and sapwood, to judge by weight and resonance whether timber was sound or beginning to rot from within. These weren't skills you could learn from books or lectures, but only through patient practice under the guidance of someone who'd spent decades working with wood. The mathematical aspects of the work fascinated me, as much as the physical techniques. Every joint had to be calculated precisely to distribute loads properly. Every angle had to be exact to ensure the finished piece would fit correctly into the ship's complex structure. A mistake of a fraction of an inch could mean the difference between a repair that lasted for years and one that failed at the first stress. But beyond the technical skills, I was learning something even more valuable about patience and persistence. Complex carpentry work couldn't be rushed, no matter how urgent the need might seem. Each step had to be completed properly before the next could begin, each measurement checked and double-checked, each cut made with deliberate care. It was a discipline that served me well in other areas of life as well. Joseph continued to expand my understanding of metalwork, teaching me to judge the quality of iron by its colour when heated and to shape it with hammer blows that were precise rather than merely powerful. The ship's forge was a marvel of compact efficiency, designed to function safely even in heavy seas, and Joseph had modified it over the years to better suit our particular needs. "Iron's like people," he told me one day as we worked on repairing a damaged gun carriage. "Some's soft and bends easy but won't hold an edge. Some's hard and keeps sharp but breaks if you stress it wrong. The trick is knowing what you're working with and treating it accordingly." His metaphors often carried deeper meanings than their surface suggested, wisdom gained through years of working with both metal and men. I learned to recognize the different types of iron and steel by subtle differences in their appearance and behavior, to predict how they would respond to different treatments, to combine different metals in ways that took advantage of each one's strengths, while compensating for their weaknesses. The work required not just physical strength, but mental discipline as well. Hot iron could be dangerous if handled carelessly, and mistakes could ruin hours of careful work in an instant. But there was deep satisfaction in taking raw metal and shaping it into something useful, in seeing your idea take physical form under your hands, in creating tools that would serve the ship and crew for years to come. As we sailed south toward our rendezvous with the Spanish treasure fleet, I found myself paying closer attention to the details of seamanship that I'd previously taken for granted. The way Teach positioned our ship relative to the others to maintain communication while avoiding the risk of collision. The subtle adjustments he made to our course to take advantage of wind shifts that might gain us a few extra miles each day. The constant calculations of speed and distance that determined when we would arrive at our intended position. Navigation in those waters required skills that went far beyond the simple coastal piloting I'd learned during my fishing years. Out of sight of land for days at a time, with only the sun and stars to guide us, determining our position required careful observation and precise calculation. I watched in fascination as our navigator took his daily sights with a brass quadrant, measuring the sun's angle above the horizon and converting those measurements into lines of position on his charts. The charts themselves were works of art as much as practical tools, hand-drawn maps that represented decades of accumulated knowledge about winds and currents, safe harbours and dangerous reefs. Some were official products of Spanish or English surveyors, captured from merchant ships or naval vessels. Others had been compiled by pirates themselves, based on years of sailing these waters and noting every hazard and opportunity. But the most valuable navigation aid was the accumulated experience of men who'd sailed these routes many times before. They knew which clouds meant weather and which were harmless, where to look for the subtle colour changes that indicated shallow water, how to read the flight patterns of seabirds to determine the direction of the nearest land. This knowledge couldn't be written down or taught in any formal way, but only absorbed through years of careful observation. The social dynamics among our expanded crew became more complex as we sailed in company with the other ships. Men who'd never met before found themselves working together on tasks that required close cooperation, and the inevitable personality conflicts had to be managed carefully to prevent them from affecting the mission. Some sailors adapted quickly to working with strangers, while others remained suspicious and standoffish. I found myself serving as an unofficial intermediary in several of these situations, probably because my background as a pressed man gave me a perspective that career pirates sometimes lacked. When tensions arose between our crew and men from one of the other ships over the proper way to rig a particular piece of equipment, I was able to suggest compromises that allowed both groups to save face while getting the work done efficiently. These diplomatic skills proved increasingly valuable as the expedition progressed. Teach began assigning me to tasks that required coordinating work between different crews, and I gradually took on an informal leadership role that went beyond my official position as an experienced deckhand. It was a responsibility I hadn't sought, but I found I had an aptitude for it that surprised me. The key, I discovered, was listening more than talking. Most conflicts arose from misunderstandings or different ways of doing the same job, and once you got past the surface disagreements, you usually found that everyone wanted the same thing: to complete the task safely and efficiently. Finding common ground required patience and the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, but it was rarely impossible. The approaching confrontation with the Spanish treasure fleet cast everything in a different light. Decisions that might have seemed routine in other circumstances took on added weight when you knew they might affect the outcome of the battle to come. Every repair had to be perfect, every piece of equipment had to be ready for maximum stress, every man had to know his role in the complex choreography of naval combat. I spent extra time checking and rechecking the rigging, looking for any sign of wear or weakness that might cause a failure at the worst possible moment. The running rigging was examined line by line, with questionable sections replaced even if they might have lasted for weeks under normal circumstances. The standing rigging was tested with unusual care, and several shrouds were set up tighter than usual to ensure they could handle the stresses of manoeuvring under fire. The guns received similar attention, with each piece dismounted and examined thoroughly before being put back into service. Carriages were checked for loose joints or cracked wood, and several were reinforced with iron bands that Joseph fashioned in his forge. Shot was sorted carefully to ensure perfectly round balls that would fly true, and powder charges were measured with precision that would have impressed a naval gunnery officer. But perhaps most importantly, the men were prepared as well as the equipment. Combat at sea was a complex dance that required split-second timing and absolute trust among crew members. Every man had to know not just his own job, but how it fit into the larger pattern of ship handling and gunfighting. Mistakes that might be merely inconvenient during routine sailing could be fatal in battle. Teach organised regular drills that tested every aspect of our combat readiness. We practiced going from routine sailing to battle stations in minimum time, with every man moving to his assigned position without confusion or delay. We rehearsed the loading and firing sequence until gun crews could serve their pieces with smooth efficiency even in simulated stress conditions. We ran through boarding scenarios, practicing the coordination between the men who would fight hand to hand and those who would continue working the ship. These exercises revealed weaknesses that might not have been apparent otherwise. Some men worked well individually, but had trouble coordinating with others under pressure. Some pieces of equipment that seemed adequate during normal operations proved inadequate under the stress of simulated combat. Some procedures that looked good on paper proved awkward or dangerous when actually implemented. Each problem was addressed methodically, with changes made to procedures, equipment modified or replaced, and additional training provided where needed. It was painstaking work that required attention to countless small details, but I was beginning to understand that success in any complex endeavour depended more on getting the details right than on grand strategies or heroic gestures. The process also revealed strengths that hadn't been fully appreciated before. Timothy proved to have exceptional coordination and quick reflexes that made him valuable as a powder monkey, carrying charges from the magazine to the guns during battle. Davies, despite his advancing years, had an intuitive understanding of gun laying that could put shot exactly where it was needed. Even some of the newer crew members showed aptitudes that could be developed and used. As the days passed and we drew closer to our objective, I found myself thinking more deeply about the nature of the life I was living. The combination of routine work and extraordinary danger created a unique perspective on what really mattered in life. Small pleasures took on enhanced significance when you knew they might be your last. A good meal, a peaceful sunset, the satisfaction of work well done, these simple things became more precious when viewed against the backdrop of mortality. The bonds between crew members deepened as well. Men who might remain casual acquaintances under normal circumstances became brothers when they knew they would soon be depending on each other for their lives. Conversations grew more personal, as if everyone felt the need to share something of themselves before it might be too late. Stories were told that had never been told before, secrets shared that had been closely guarded. I found myself opening up in ways that surprised me, talking about my childhood and my father and the dreams I'd once had for my life. Other men shared similar stories, and I began to see patterns in how we'd all ended up here. Most had started with limited options and had made the best choices available to them at the time, even if those choices led to places they'd never intended to go. There was something both sad and inspiring about these conversations. Sad because they revealed how many lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond anyone's control, how many dreams had been abandoned or deferred because of poverty or war or simple bad luck. But inspiring too, because they showed how resilient people could be, how they could adapt to new circumstances and find meaning even in lives that looked nothing like what they'd originally planned. The weather continued fair as we approached the coordinates, where our scouts had reported the Spanish fleet would pass. The sea was a deep blue that stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional white cap where wind met wave at just the right angle. The air was warm but not oppressive, with enough breeze to keep the ships moving at a good pace without requiring constant adjustment of sail. But beneath the peaceful surface, everyone could feel the tension building. Conversations grew quieter and more serious. Men checked their personal weapons more frequently, making sure pistols were loaded and primed, cutlass edges sharp and ready. The ship's boys went about their duties with unusual solemnity, sensing the mood of their elders even if they didn't fully understand its cause. The morning we finally sighted the Spanish treasure fleet dawned clear and calm, with visibility that stretched to the horizon in every direction. I was in the maintop, helping to repair a block that had shown signs of weakness during the previous day's sail handling when the lookout's call echoed across the water. "Sail ho! Multiple sail to the southeast." Through Teach's telescope, passed hand to hand among the officers, the enemy fleet resolved into a formation that was both beautiful and terrifying. 6 great galleons sailed in line ahead, their hulls black with massive gun ports, their towering forecastles and stern castles making them look like floating fortresses. Around them sailed their escorts, smaller but still formidable vessels whose job was to screen the treasure ships from exactly the kind of attack we were planning. The Spanish had chosen their formation well. I could see even from my limited vantage point. The treasure ships were protected in the centre, with the warships positioned to intercept any attacking force. Their course was direct and purposeful, suggesting confidence in their ability to fight off any pirates bold enough to challenge them. It was going to be a very different kind of battle than any we'd fought before. Teach called the crew to quarters with unusual formality, his voice carrying clearly across the ship as he explained what we faced and what would be required of each man. His words were simple and direct, without false optimism, but also without unnecessary emphasis on the dangers ahead. We all knew the risks, and dwelling on them would serve no useful purpose. "We're going to take those ships," he said simply, "not because it's easy, but because it's possible if we do everything right. Every man knows his job. Do it well, look after your messmates, and we'll all be rich men before the sun sets." The battle preparation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't the hasty scramble that had characterized our previous encounters with lightly defended merchant ships, but a methodical process that transformed the Queen Anne's Revenge from a sailing ship into a fighting machine. Partitions were removed to clear the gun decks, hammocks were taken down and stowed in the nettings where they would provide some protection against small arms fire, and sand was scattered on the deck to provide footing when blood made the planking slippery. I was assigned to the crew of one of the main deck guns, a long 18-pounder that required 6 men to serve it properly. My job was to help load the piece and keep it supplied with powder and shot from the magazine, work that would require me to move constantly between the gun and the lower decks throughout the battle. It was responsibility that both honoured and terrified me, knowing that the effectiveness of our firepower might depend on how well I did my job. The gun crew worked together with practiced efficiency, each man checking his equipment and making sure he understood his role in the complex sequence of loading, aiming and firing that would have to be repeated as quickly as possible throughout the action. The gun captain, an old sailor named Phillips, who'd served in the Royal Navy before turning pirate, explained the tactics we would use against ships much larger than ourselves. "We're faster than they are," he said, running his hands over the gun's smooth bronze barrel. "That's our advantage. We get in close, hit them hard and quick, then get out before they can bring their full firepower to bear. It's going to be hot work, lads, but if we keep our heads and do our jobs, we'll send those Spanish dogs to the bottom with their gold." The approach to battle seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Hours of manoeuvring as our small fleet positioned itself for the attack, then suddenly we were closing rapidly, with the enemy formation, the water between us shrinking with each passing minute. The Spanish ships loomed larger and larger until I could make out individual gun ports and the faces of men standing at their rails. Then the first broadside crashed out from the lead Spanish escort, and the battle was joined in earnest. The sound was indescribable, not just the thunder of the guns, but the screaming of shot overhead, the crash of iron striking wood, the shouts of men, and the groaning of the ship as she absorbed the shock of enemy fire. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see and harder to breathe, and the acrid smell of gunpowder burned your throat and made your eyes water. Our gun fired in return, the massive recoil sending the carriage rolling back across the deck with a violence that would crush anyone caught in its path. The crew leapt into action immediately, swabbing the barrel clean while I ran below for the next charge of powder and shot. The magazine was a scene of controlled chaos, with powder monkeys like Timothy running constantly between the storage areas and the guns above, carrying the ammunition that would determine whether we lived or died. The battle developed into a running fight that tested every skill we'd learned during months of preparation. Our superior speed allowed us to avoid the close-range broadsides that would have smashed us to pieces, but it also meant we had to make every shot count during the brief moments when our guns would bear on the enemy. It was a deadly game of thrust and parry, with each side trying to gain the advantage that would allow them to deliver a decisive blow. I lost track of time completely as the action continued. Load, fire, reload became an endless cycle that consumed all my attention and energy. My world shrank to the narrow space around our gun, the familiar faces of my crewmates, the constant need to keep ammunition flowing from the magazine below. The larger battle faded into background noise, important but beyond my immediate control. But gradually I became aware that things were going better than we had any right to expect. The Spanish formation was beginning to break apart as individual ships found themselves cut off from mutual support. One of the escort frigates had taken severe damage to her rigging and was falling behind the main formation. Another was showing signs of fire damage that suggested we'd managed to get hot shot into her somewhere vulnerable. The treasure galleons themselves were proving harder nuts to crack. Their massive construction absorbed punishment that would have sunk smaller ships, and their heavy armament made it dangerous to get close enough for really effective fire. But they were also slow and clumsy, unable to maneuver quickly enough to bring their guns to bear on our fast-moving ships. It was Vane's sloop that finally broke the deadlock, using her shallow draft to approach one of the galleons from an angle where the big ship's guns couldn't depress enough to hit her. The Ranger poured a devastating, raking fire into the galleon's stern, smashing through the ornate windows of the captain's cabin and sending shot the length of the ship. The damage was catastrophic, dismounting guns and killing dozens of men in a few terrible minutes. The sight of their flagship taking such punishment seemed to break the Spanish resolve. One by one, the surviving ships began to strike their colours, hauling down the proud banners of Spain in token of surrender. The battle was over, though the smoke and confusion made it hard to tell exactly when the fighting stopped and the aftermath began. The silence that followed the last gunshot was almost as overwhelming as the noise of battle had been. My ears rang from the constant thunder of artillery, and everything seemed unnaturally quiet after hours of continuous sound. Men moved about the ship like ghosts, checking for damage and casualties, their faces blackened with powder smoke and streaked with sweat. Our own losses had been remarkably light, considering the odds we'd faced. A few men wounded by splinters, one gun crew badly hurt when an enemy shot struck their piece directly, but no deaths among our ship's company. The Queen Anne's Revenge herself had taken damage to her rigging and several holes in her hull, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with the materials and skills we had aboard. The prizes were beyond anything we'd ever imagined. 6 treasure galleons, loaded with silver from the mines of Peru, their holds packed with coins and ingots that represented the wealth of a continent. The value was almost impossible to calculate, more money than any of us had ever seen or hoped to see. My share alone would be enough to buy a small kingdom if I chose to collect it and disappear into a life of comfortable obscurity. But as I stood at the rail that evening, watching the sun set behind our captured fleet, I found myself thinking, not about the treasure, but about the men who'd died to protect it. Spanish sailors who'd fought bravely for their king and their duty, men with families and hopes and dreams, not so different from our own. War always had a human cost, but somehow it seemed more personal when you'd looked into the faces of the men you were fighting. The aftermath of battle was always strange, a mixture of celebration and sorrow that left you feeling unsettled and emotional. The adrenaline of combat took time to fade, leaving you jumpy and restless, even when the danger was past. Some men dealt with it by drinking heavily, others by talking endlessly about every detail of the action. I found myself wanting to be alone, to process what had happened in my own quiet way. The days that followed were busy with the practical details of securing our prizes and distributing the treasure according to the agreements worked out beforehand among the captains. It was complicated work that required careful accounting and diplomatic skill to ensure that every man received his fair share without creating resentments that could tear the alliance apart. But even as we worked to divide the spoils, I could sense that something had changed among the crews. The successful attack on the Spanish treasure fleet had been a triumph beyond our wildest dreams, but it had also marked us as enemies of every European power with interests in the Caribbean. There would be no safe harbours for us now, no friendly ports where we could refit and resupply. We had become outlaws in the truest sense, men with prices on their heads who could trust no one outside their own immediate circle. The realization was both frightening and liberating. Frightening because it meant we were now committed to this life, with no possibility of return to respectability. But liberating too, because it freed us from the need to pretend we were anything other than what we were. We were pirates, and the whole world knew it, and there was a certain honesty in that acknowledgement. As we sailed north toward the Carolina coast with our captured treasure, I found myself thinking about what came next. The money would provide security for the rest of my life if I lived to enjoy it, but it wouldn't change who I'd become during these years at sea, or erase the experiences that had shaped me into someone I barely recognized from my former self. The skills I'd learned, the confidence I'd gained, the bonds I'd formed with my shipmates, these things had value that went beyond any monetary calculation. I was no longer the frightened young fisherman who'd been pressed into service almost 2 years earlier. I'd become someone else entirely, someone who could handle responsibility and danger with equal calm, someone who others looked to for guidance and leadership. The question was what to do with this new identity. The obvious choice was to take my share of the treasure and disappear, to buy a new life somewhere far from the sea and its dangers. But I'd grown to love the life I was living, despite its risks and moral ambiguities. The sea had become my home in a way that no land could ever be, and the men I sailed with had become family in ways that went deeper than blood relationships. As I stood the middle watch that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship working in the seaway, I realized that I'd already made my choice. Whatever the future held, I would meet it as William Fletcher, seaman and pirate, a man who'd found his place in the world aboard a ship that flew the black flag. The treasure in our holds might change many things, but it wouldn't change who I'd become or where I belonged. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human ambitions and fears. The sea stretched away in all directions, vast and mysterious and full of possibilities. Somewhere ahead lay new adventures, new challenges, new tests of the skills and courage I'd developed during my time with Blackbeard's crew. I found myself looking forward to whatever came next, confident that I could handle it with the same steady competence that had brought me through everything so far. The morning would bring new tasks and new decisions, but for now I was content to stand my watch and listen to the ship's song as she carried us toward whatever future awaited us. The life of a pirate was uncertain and dangerous, but it was also rich with experiences and opportunities that would never have come my way in my previous existence. Whatever the cost, I'd learned things about myself and the world that no amount of conventional education could have taught me. The treasure was just money, when all was said and done. The real prize was the person I'd become and the life I'd learned to live, skills and knowledge and confidence that no one could take away from me, no matter what happened in the years to come. In finding my place aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, I'd found myself as well, and that was worth more than all the Spanish silver in our holds. Blackbeard, the Terror of the Atlantic, a historical account. The making of a legend. Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard, emerged from the shadows of early 18th century maritime records to become the most infamous pirate of the golden age of piracy. Born around 1680, likely in Bristol, England, Teach's early life remains largely shrouded in mystery, as was common for men of his station. What we know with certainty is that by 1716 he had arrived in the Caribbean waters that would become his hunting ground, initially serving under the established pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold. The transition from legitimate sailor to pirate was not uncommon during this period. The War of Spanish Succession had ended in 1713, leaving thousands of experienced seamen unemployed. Many former privateers who had been legally sanctioned to attack enemy ships during wartime found themselves without legitimate employment. The choice between starvation and piracy was often an easy one to make. Under Hornigold's tutelage, Teach learned the intricate arts of navigation, naval combat, and perhaps most importantly, the psychology of intimidation that would later make him legendary. Hornigold, himself a formidable pirate who had captured numerous vessels throughout the Bahamas, recognized in Teach a natural aptitude for leadership and an understanding of the theatrical aspects of piracy that could prove invaluable. The birth of Blackbeard. By 1717, Teach had established himself sufficiently to command his own vessel and crew. It was during this period that he began cultivating the terrifying persona that would become his trademark. Standing over 6 feet tall in an era when the average man was considerably shorter, Teach cut an imposing figure even before his theatrical enhancements. But it was his magnificent black beard, from which his nickname derived, that became his most distinctive feature. Contemporary accounts describe how Teach would weave hemp rope and slow-burning matches into his beard before battle, creating an otherworldly appearance as smoke wreathed his face. This calculated intimidation served a practical purpose. Many vessels surrendered without a fight upon seeing the demonic figure approaching, sparing both sides unnecessary bloodshed and preserving valuable cargo. The psychological warfare extended beyond personal appearance. Teach understood that reputation could be more valuable than firepower. Stories of his cruelty, whether entirely accurate or embellished, spread throughout the shipping lanes. Merchant captains would tell tales of his violence in every port, inadvertently serving as his publicity agents. This reputation meant that the mere sight of his distinctive black flag could cause entire crews to surrender immediately. the Queen Anne's Revenge. In late 1717, Teach's fortunes changed dramatically when he encountered a French slave ship named La Concorde near the island of Saint Vincent. The vessel, commanded by Captain Pierre Dosset, was carrying a cargo of enslaved Africans bound for the Caribbean markets. After a brief engagement, Teach captured the ship, which would become the foundation of his maritime empire. Teach immediately recognized the potential of his prize. La Concorde was a substantial vessel, measuring approximately 103 feet in length, with a beam of 24 feet. Originally built as a merchant vessel, she was well suited for conversion to a pirate ship. Teach ordered extensive modifications to transform her into a formidable warship, which he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, possibly in honour of the recently deceased English monarch, or as a sardonic reference to the ongoing political tensions of the era. The conversion process was extensive and methodical. Additional cannon ports were cut into her hull, ultimately allowing her to carry 40 guns of various calibers. This firepower was extraordinary for a pirate vessel. Most legitimate naval ships of the period carried fewer guns. The modifications also included reinforcing the deck structures to support the weight of the additional artillery and creating more spacious quarters for his growing crew, which eventually numbered around 300 men. The Queen Anne's Revenge became more than just a ship. She was a floating fortress and symbol of Teach's power. Her black hull and blood-red interior created an ominous appearance that complemented Blackbeard's own theatrical presentation. The ship's speed and maneuverability, combined with her overwhelming firepower, made her nearly unbeatable in the coastal waters where Teach preferred to operate. Reign of Terror. With his formidable flagship, Blackbeard embarked on one of the most successful piratical careers in recorded history. Operating primarily along the American colonial coast from Virginia to Georgia, he established a network of operations that demonstrated sophisticated planning and execution. Unlike many pirates who operated as mere raiders, Teach functioned more like the commander of a private navy. His fleet grew to include several vessels working in coordination. Besides the Queen Anne's Revenge, he commanded smaller, faster sloops that could pursue merchant vessels in shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. This diversified fleet allowed him to control vast stretches of coastline and intercept ships along multiple shipping routes simultaneously. One of Blackbeard's most audacious operations occurred in May 1718, when he effectively blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina. For nearly a week, his fleet intercepted every vessel attempting to enter or leave the harbour. The psychological impact was enormous. Charleston was one of the most important ports in the southern colonies, and its complete shutdown sent shockwaves throughout the colonial economy. During this blockade, Blackbeard captured several prominent citizens, including Samuel Wragg, a member of the Colonial Council, along with his young son. Rather than demanding traditional ransom of gold or silver, Teach made an unusual request, a chest of medical supplies. This demand revealed both practical thinking and shrewd psychology. Medical supplies were desperately needed by his crew, who suffered from various tropical diseases common to Caribbean pirates. Additionally, the modest nature of the ransom made colonial authorities appear unreasonable if they refused, while demonstrating that Blackbeard's power was such that he could afford to make symbolic rather than purely mercenary demands. The successful Charleston blockade established Blackbeard as more than just another pirate. He had demonstrated the ability to disrupt colonial commerce on a massive scale. The colonial governments from Virginia to Georgia began to view him as a serious threat to their economic stability and political authority. Masters of maritime warfare. Blackbeard's success stemmed not just from brutality, but from sophisticated tactical knowledge and innovative approaches to naval warfare. His crews were among the most disciplined and well-organized in pirate history, operating under a detailed code of conduct that governed everything from the distribution of booty to behaviour during battle. The articles governing Blackbeard's crew were comprehensive and surprisingly democratic. Each crew member had a vote in major decisions, and officers were elected by popular choice. Compensation was predetermined and fair, with the captain receiving only 2 shares compared to each crew member's 1 share, a modest premium compared to the vast disparities common on legitimate merchant vessels. These articles also provided for compensation for injuries sustained in battle, creating an early form of disability insurance that was remarkably progressive for the era. Combat tactics employed by Blackbeard's fleet demonstrated sophisticated understanding of naval warfare principles. Rather than relying solely on superior firepower, his ships often used coordinated maneuvers that maximized their advantages while minimizing risks. Smaller, faster vessels would harry and confuse enemy ships, while the Queen Anne's Revenge positioned herself for devastating broadside attacks. The psychological aspects of Blackbeard's warfare were equally sophisticated. His crews were trained to create maximum visual and auditory impact during attacks. They would fire weapons continuously during approaches, creating clouds of smoke and deafening noise that could break enemy morale before boarding actions began. The crews themselves were encouraged to dress and behave in the most intimidating manner possible, with many adopting exotic weapons and clothing that enhanced their fearsome appearance. Political manoeuvring and colonial corruption. What set Blackbeard apart from many of his contemporaries was his understanding of political realities and his willingness to engage with colonial authorities when it served his purposes. In 1718, he accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, officially ending his piratical career and granting him legal protection from prosecution. This pardon was part of a broader amnesty program offered by the British government, designed to end the piracy problem through reconciliation rather than military action. However, Blackbeard's relationship with Governor Eden appears to have been more complex than a simple acceptance of amnesty. Evidence suggests that Eden may have been receiving a portion of Blackbeard's profits in exchange for protection and advance warning of naval operations against pirates. The arrangement with Eden allowed Blackbeard to establish a base of operations in Bath, North Carolina, where he lived openly under his real name of Edward Teach. He even married a local woman, his 14th wife, according to some accounts, though the accuracy of this number is questionable. This period of apparent respectability was likely a strategic pause rather than genuine retirement, as Blackbeard used his legal status to refit his ships and recruit new crew members. The relationship between pirates and colonial officials was often characterized by such ambiguous arrangements. Colonial governors faced the difficult task of maintaining order and protecting commerce while operating with limited resources and questionable support from London. Some governors found it expedient to reach informal accommodations with pirates, accepting a degree of illegal activity in exchange for reduced overall disruption to colonial trade. The final campaign. Blackbeard's period of legal respectability proved short-lived. By the autumn of 1718, reports began circulating that he had returned to piracy, capturing merchant vessels and harassing shipping along the North Carolina coast. Whether these reports were accurate or whether Blackbeard was being framed by enemies seeking to end his protected status remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that Alexander Spotswood, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, had determined that Blackbeard represented a continuing threat that could not be tolerated. Spotswood was a career military officer and colonial administrator who understood the economic and political implications of allowing piracy to flourish near major shipping routes. He also appears to have been personally affronted by what he viewed as Blackbeard's mockery of legitimate authority. Unable to operate openly in North Carolina Due to Governor Eden's protection of Blackbeard, Spotswood was forced to plan a covert operation. He secretly commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to hunt down and capture Blackbeard, providing him with 2 armed sloops, HMS Pearl and HMS Lime, along with experienced crews, and authorization to cross into North Carolina waters if necessary. The legal justification for this operation was questionable at best. Spotswood was essentially authorizing military action in another colony's territory without proper consultation or authorization. However, he calculated that success would justify the irregular methods, while failure would likely end in his own disgrace regardless of legal niceties. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet. On November 22, 1718, Lieutenant Maynard's expedition located Blackbeard's fleet anchored in Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow waterway along the North Carolina coast that provided an ideal hiding place for pirates due to its difficult navigation and multiple escape routes. Blackbeard was aboard his flagship, now a smaller vessel than the Queen Anne's Revenge, which had been lost several months earlier when it ran aground near Beaufort Inlet. The ensuing battle became one of the most famous naval engagements in pirate history, though accounts of exactly what transpired vary significantly depending on the source. What is generally agreed upon is that Maynard's force consisted of approximately 60 men aboard 2 sloops, while Blackbeard commanded roughly 25 pirates aboard his single vessel. The engagement began at dawn, with both sides manoeuvring for advantageous positions in the shallow waters of the inlet. Blackbeard initially held the superior position, as his crew's intimate knowledge of local waters allowed them to position their ship where the deeper draft naval vessels could not easily approach. The pirates opened fire first, raking Maynard's lead vessel with grape shot and musket fire that caused significant casualties among the naval crews. Recognizing that conventional naval tactics would not succeed in the confined waters, Maynard ordered his men to hide below deck, creating the impression that the pirates' fire had been devastatingly effective. This deception lured Blackbeard into attempting a boarding action, bringing his vessel alongside Maynard's sloop, where the hidden naval personnel could engage in close combat. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was brutal and decisive. Contemporary accounts describe Blackbeard as fighting with extraordinary ferocity, wielding both cutlass and pistol with deadly effect. However, he was ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers. According to Maynard's official report, Blackbeard sustained 25 wounds, including 5 pistol shots, before finally succumbing. The end of an era. Blackbeard's death marked more than the end of a single pirate's career. It symbolized the beginning of the end for the golden age of piracy itself. The systematic approach used by Spotswood and Maynard to eliminate Blackbeard became a model for subsequent anti-piracy operations throughout the Caribbean and American colonies. Lieutenant Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head severed and suspended from his ship's bowsprit as proof of the pirate's death, and as a warning to others who might consider following his example. This grisly trophy was later displayed in Hampton, Virginia, where it remained for years as a macabre tourist attraction. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew were captured, and most were subsequently tried and executed for piracy. The political ramifications of Blackbeard's death extended far beyond the immediate military victory. Governor Eden of North Carolina faced intense scrutiny regarding his relationship with the pirate, ultimately damaging his political career and reputation. The incident highlighted the complex relationships between colonial authorities and illegal maritime activities, leading to increased oversight from London and more standardized approaches to combating piracy. Spotswood, meanwhile, was initially criticized for his unauthorized military action in another colony's territory. However, the popular acclaim that followed Blackbeard's death ultimately vindicated his decision and enhanced his reputation as an effective colonial administrator. the successful operation demonstrated that even the most formidable pirates could be defeated through careful planning and coordinated military action. Legacy and historical impact. The death of Blackbeard did not immediately end piracy in American waters, but it marked a crucial turning point in the ongoing struggle between legitimate authority and maritime criminals. His career had demonstrated both the potential rewards and ultimate futility of the piratical lifestyle, while his dramatic end provided colonial authorities with a powerful propaganda victory. From a broader historical perspective, Blackbeard's career illuminated many of the social, economic, and political tensions that characterized early 18th century colonial America. His success exploited weaknesses in colonial defense systems and highlighted the sometimes corrupt relationships between official authority and criminal enterprise. The methods used to defeat him foreshadowed the more systematic and coordinated approaches that would eventually eliminate organized piracy from American waters. The economic impact of Blackbeard's career was substantial and long-lasting. His disruption of shipping routes increased insurance costs and shipping delays throughout the colonial period, contributing to economic inefficiencies that affected trade patterns for years after his death. Conversely, his elimination helped stabilize maritime commerce and contributed to the economic growth that characterized the American colonies in the mid-18th century. The man behind the legend. Separating the historical Edward Teach from the legendary Blackbeard requires careful analysis of contemporary sources and later embellishments. What emerges is a portrait of a man who was undoubtedly ruthless and violent, but also intelligent, charismatic, and strategically minded. His success was not accidental. It resulted from careful planning, superior organization, and an intuitive understanding of human psychology. The theatrical aspects of Blackbeard's persona, while often dismissed as mere showmanship, served crucial practical purposes. His fearsome appearance and cultivated reputation for cruelty often eliminated the need for actual violence, preserving both lives and valuable cargo. This approach demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the economics of piracy, where efficiency and profit margins were just as important as raw courage and fighting ability. Personal accounts from crew members and captives suggest that Blackbeard was capable of both extreme brutality and unexpected mercy, depending on circumstances and his strategic objectives. He appears to have understood the value of maintaining a reputation for unpredictability, as enemies who could not anticipate his actions were more likely to surrender without resistance. The complexity of Blackbeard's character is perhaps best illustrated by his relationship with colonial society during his brief period of respectability in North Carolina. Contemporary accounts suggest that he was capable of considerable charm and social grace when it served his purposes, indicating a level of education and cultural sophistication that contradicts the crude stereotype often associated with pirates. Maritime technology and tactics. Blackbeard's career coincided with significant developments in naval technology and tactics that influenced both legitimate navies and pirate operations. The early 18th century saw improvements in cannon design, navigation instruments, and ship construction that made long-range maritime operations more feasible and effective. The Queen Anne's Revenge represented the cutting edge of pirate ship design, incorporating modifications that maximized both offensive capability and operational flexibility. The addition of extra cannon ports and reinforced deck structures created a vessel that could engage larger naval ships on relatively equal terms while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for successful piracy. Navigation techniques employed by Blackbeard's crews were among the most advanced of their time. Operating in the complex coastal waters of the American colonies required intimate knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal weather patterns. The ability to navigate shallow inlets and hidden harbours provided crucial advantages over larger naval vessels that were restricted to deeper waters. Communication systems used by Blackbeard's fleet demonstrated sophisticated coordination capabilities. Multiple vessels operating in concert required reliable methods for transmitting orders and coordinating maneuvers. The use of flag signals, predetermined rendezvous points, and coordinated timing allowed his ships to function as an integrated naval force rather than independent raiders. Social and cultural context. The golden age of piracy, of which Blackbeard was perhaps the most famous representative, reflected broader social and economic tensions of the early 18th century. The end of major European wars had created large populations of unemployed seamen with valuable military skills but limited legitimate opportunities for employment. Colonial society during Blackbeard's era was characterized by extreme economic inequality and limited social mobility. For many men of working-class backgrounds, piracy offered the possibility of wealth and status that would have been impossible through legitimate means. The democratic organization of pirate crews, with their elected officers and equitable distribution of profits, provided an appealing alternative to the rigid hierarchies of legitimate society. The relationship between pirates and colonial communities was often more complex than simple antagonism. Pirates were significant consumers of goods and services, bringing considerable amounts of currency into local economies. Many colonial merchants were willing to trade with pirates, despite legal prohibitions, creating an underground economy that complicated official efforts to suppress piracy. Cultural attitudes toward pirates during Blackbeard's era were similarly complex. While officially condemned as criminals, pirates were often viewed with a mixture of fear and admiration by common people who saw them as rebels against oppressive authority. This ambivalent attitude helps explain how pirates could find refuge and support in colonial communities despite official hostility. Economic dimensions of piracy. Blackbeard's operations must be understood within the broader context of early 18th century Atlantic commerce. The colonial economy was heavily dependent on maritime trade, with ships carrying everything from raw materials to manufactured goods along predictable routes that made them vulnerable to piratical attack. The economic calculations that drove piracy were remarkably sophisticated. Successful pirates like Blackbeard had to balance potential profits against operational costs, risks of capture, and the need to maintain crew loyalty. The most successful operations targeted high-value cargoes while minimizing damage to ships and crew that might be useful for future operations. Insurance markets in London and other commercial centres were significantly affected by piratical activity. Lloyd's of London and other underwriters charged higher premiums for voyages through pirate-infested waters, costs that were ultimately passed on to consumers throughout the Atlantic world. The elimination of major pirate threats like Blackbeard contributed to reduced shipping costs and economic growth. The distribution of wealth within pirate crews represented a radical departure from legitimate maritime practices. While merchant ship crews received fixed wages regardless of voyage profitability, pirates shared in the proceeds of their captures according to predetermined formulas. This system created powerful incentives for crew loyalty and effectiveness while providing economic opportunities unavailable in legitimate employment. Military innovation and adaptation. Blackbeard's tactical innovations influenced both pirate and naval practices throughout the early 18th century. His use of coordinated multi-ship operations required communication and timing methods that were later adopted by legitimate navies. The psychological warfare techniques he pioneered became standard practices among Caribbean pirates. The modifications made to the Queen Anne's Revenge reflected broader trends in naval architecture and armament. The conversion of merchant vessels to warships required careful attention to weight distribution, structural integrity, and firing angles. These technical challenges drove innovations in ship design that influenced both pirate and naval construction. Recruitment and training methods employed by Blackbeard's organization demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human resource management. Attracting and retaining skilled crew members required competitive compensation, fair treatment, and opportunities for advancement. The most successful pirate captains understood that their crews were their most valuable assets. Logistical support for extended pirate operations required complex networks of suppliers, informants, and safe harbours. Blackbeard's ability to maintain his fleet in operational condition while avoiding naval patrols depended on careful coordination of these support systems. The disruption of these networks was often more effective than direct military action in eliminating pirate threats. Conclusion: the end of an age. Edward Teach's transformation into Blackbeard and his subsequent career as the most notorious pirate of his age represented both the pinnacle and the beginning of the end of the golden age of piracy. His success demonstrated the potential rewards of organised maritime crime, while his dramatic defeat showed that even the most formidable pirates could be eliminated through determined official action. The methods developed to combat Blackbeard became the template for subsequent anti-piracy operations throughout the Atlantic world. The combination of military force, political coordination, and economic pressure that ultimately defeated him proved effective against other pirate leaders and organizations. Within a decade of his death, organized piracy had largely disappeared from American waters. The legend of Blackbeard has endured far longer than the historical reality of his career. His larger-than-life persona and dramatic end provided perfect material for writers, historians, and popular culture creators seeking compelling narratives of adventure and conflict. However, the historical Edward Teach was perhaps more interesting than the legendary Blackbeard, a complex figure who understood the economic, political, and social forces of his time and attempted to exploit them for personal advantage. The study of Blackbeard's career provides valuable insights into the nature of early 18th century colonial society, the development of maritime technology and tactics, and the complex relationships between legal authority and criminal enterprise. His story illuminates a crucial period in American colonial history when the balance between order and chaos hung in the balance, and individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire societies. In the end, Blackbeard's legacy rests not only on his notorious deeds, but on his role as a symbol of both the opportunities and dangers that characterized the early American experience. His career demonstrated that, in a world of uncertain authority and limited resources, individuals with sufficient determination and skill could challenge established power structures, though ultimately at great personal cost. The dramatic conclusion of his story at Ocracoke Inlet marked not just the end of one man's career, but the closing of a chapter in American colonial history that would never be repeated.